Today on the Transplant Helper, we're going to be talking about how one gets listed for transplant, how long they potentially could wait, and at the end of this, something extremely important that you need to know before you're ever listed that will definitely help you in the end. Stay tuned. Hit the subscribe button and the bell notification to become part of the Transplant Helper community. Hey folks, welcome back to Transplant Helper again today. My name is Jim Merle, and I just want to share with you a question I got the other day. Maybe it was a statement. I don't know if you call it a question, statement, whatever. I definitely gave an answer to it at the time, messaged the person back and gave an answer. But at the same time, I thought I would share with you and explain a little bit because I think it involves a huge misconception in the transplant world. Now, this person is just getting started in the transplant process. They're being evaluated currently for heart transplant, and they're really concerned about that wait time. I had a program just the other day about the wait, how the wait can be the most difficult part of the transplant process and such. They'd actually watched that and then replied back or told me about this story based on that. They said they were in clinic the other day. And of course, we're, again, like they are right now, most of us would be. They're in the early stages, so they're kind of nervous. And they tried to strike up a conversation with a guy who was sitting across the aisle there. And he had said something about having a heart transplant, so they tried to get in a conversation. And as they were talking, she asked him how long he waited for transplant. Again, had seen the show, was concerned about that. Everybody's concerned about how long they'll wait. And this guy looked at her and said, I actually was listed for transplant for 22 years. I waited for 22 years. And that blew her mind, but at the same time, it scared her to death. And so she wrote me and told me about that encounter and asked me if, what I thought about that. Why would anybody wait for 22 years? And how could anyone live for 22 years waiting for transplant? I try to be careful, especially not to be disrespectful because I do not know the situation. But let me tell you what I think about that statement. I waited or I was listed for 22 years. It didn't happen. There is no way, no how, no way that I can conceive that anyone actually waited on the list for 22 years. Now, was someone told at some point in their journey, 22 years before they were transplanted, one day you might need a transplant? I agree that probably happened. As a matter of fact, I was told 6 years prior to actually getting a transplant, I was told that's what would eventually happen. I was told at that point in time, we're going to continue to evaluate you, follow you, keep up with the situation. And in your future, at some point, you're more than likely going to need a heart transplant. That was 6 years out. I believe that. This man may have been told 22 years before his transplant, one day you're going to need a transplant. Or maybe, I don't know how old he was, maybe it was his parents when he was a child. One day your child may need a transplant. But I promise you, he was not listed for transplant for 22 years. Just not going to happen. Not even on status 7. If you're not familiar with status 7, that's basically the listing. You got 1 through 7 now on the new system. Status 7 is the listing at the very bottom of this that basically says you're inactive. You're on the list, but you're not going to get a call. That's what status 7 is. And I don't think anybody's even waited on status 7 for 22 years or anywhere close to that because that's not what they do. The list is set aside for people who there is an immediate need to some extent. Now, immediate for status 6 is going to be different from immediate status 1, but where immediately they need a transplant, where they are in full-blown failure of whatever organ. In my example, a heart, but they're in full-blown failure of whatever organ, and that organ is assumed that it's going to cost them their life if they are not transplanted. And transplant should be, and generally always is, the last result. It's when everything else has been exhausted, every technique, every procedure, every experimental trial has been exhausted. That's at the point when the last shebang of all of it comes down to you needing a transplant. It's the last straw, if you will, in the process. And transplant is a treatment. It's like any other treatment. It's a treatment, not a cure, but it is definitely a good one. It's definitely a good one. But I would suspect, and I told her, this man did not wait 22 years on the transplant list. He just didn't do it. Now, where does the misconception come in this? I think the misconception comes in, and it's an innocent one, by the way, where a lot of us are going and seeing our general practitioners. Maybe we've had some issues. I'll use the heart for an example, and we've had to go see a cardiologist, and that cardiologist in passing says, you may need a transplant, or I think you need a transplant, or whatever. But them saying that and you being listed for transplant are two totally different polar opposite things. Most of you know already, because you've been through the process, you've gotten through all of it. You know it takes an extensive evaluation. That evaluation, generally speaking, I'm using a heart transplant for example, generally takes place in anywhere between 15 and 20 individualized tests and procedures, and just they delve into you. They will check you out from the top of your head to the bottom of your feet. Every single thing on you is going to be examined. It's going to be questioned or brought into question. They're going to be results, and based on those results, transplant listings can take place. But that evaluation is going to happen. Now, I've had people tell me, well, they went through the evaluation, it took 3 months. Yeah, I'm sorry, that happens sometimes. I've had a few people tell me they got their whole evaluation in a matter of a day. Possible. It'd be rough, be a rough day. All the poking and prodding and, again, procedures and tests that go into that, exams, be rough. But generally speaking, the evaluation, especially if you can get it done inpatient, which I always advise, if you can be inpatient for that, it's easier than outpatient, because they just can do the test back to back to back. And sometimes they do tests in the middle of the night, versus if you were going into the doctor, to the clinic every day or two, that'd only be daytime hours. But if they do it inpatient, generally speaking, we're talking about a week or less. Basically, and there may be some tests they have to schedule out further than that, or maybe they do one test and they say, well, because of this result, we need this result, so they add tests on. But about a week or so is what it's required. But again, it is required. No one doctor can stand back and listen to your heart or whatever, or listen to your lungs and say you need a transplant. They may hear something that causes them to be concerned and worried. They may have some blood work that proves that concern is valid, but it takes a full evaluation. Again, I know most of you know this, but if we've got a guy here sitting in clinic that's telling someone he was listed or waited for transplant for 22 years, and that scares the socks off of them, we need to talk about that. We need to discuss. That didn't happen. To be actually listed for transplant requires a huge evaluation. It requires approval and signing off with the United Network for Organ Sharing, in our case in the United States, where they decide this person has no other option available aside from transplant. This is the way it's got to be. Okay, so I know the wait times are long. I know they can be stressful. And again, we had the whole program on it, which kind of spawned this question. But at the same time, they're not going to be that long. You may know someone that waited years. I know someone who waited 5 years for a lung transplant. You may wait that long, and you may be up and down the listing. You may be status 7 for a while, so inactive. And of course, that's a lot of times why the wait seems so long. You may be very difficult to match. You may have antibodies that are hard to match. Body size, all that. But at the end of the day, depending on the organ, the averages are going to be inside of a window, and there are no guarantees. But I would not be concerned about waiting for 22 years or anything like that. Again, it just ain't going to happen. Being listed for transplant is just that, it's being listed. Waiting for transplant may be different in someone's mind, but it's not actually being listed. I appreciate you joining me today. I know this has kind of been random, but I just felt like I had to answer that, because there's misconceptions even among our family. Okay. I know a lady, I need to quit rambling, but I know a lady one day who went to her general practitioner. He told her she needed a lung transplant. She came and told her family, and her family, wanted her put on the prayer list at church because she was going to be having a lung transplant next week. Now, not making fun, certainly pray for the lady anyway, but not exactly how it works. It's just not. Thank you so much for joining me today. Until next time, stay stronger, friends.